Well, ladies and gentlemen, in South Africa, we like to do things the hard way. We like to have forms of international isolation, economic vulnerability, and internal policy decay. Well, thanks to the ANC, because in South Africa, we don't like to do things the easy way, now do we? Now, before we get on to the main videos of today, can I yet again remind you, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel, and if you'd like to support the work that I do here, you're welcome to buy me a coffee. The link is in the description box below. So the first is, let's just look at the Australia-Sydney massacre, because the news has come out that there were two individuals that attempted to stop the massacre before the massacre had actually occurred. As the two individuals had come out of their car with their firearms, two individuals attempted to stop the attempted massacre and were shot. Video footage can be seen of the two individuals attempting to stop the massacre, but unfortunately they did not make it. This does raise a larger question, and that is, what happens to an unarmed population when individuals who are intent on causing the maximum amount of damage go out on rampages? The police are slow to respond, and you yourself are your first responder. And in those instances, in those nations where they have disarmed their population, such as Australia, the individual has no means to defend themselves. Now moving on to South Africa, let's look at the G20. Yes, the G20 is still an issue because, as you know, South Africa has been sidelined by the US. South Africa was not invited to the first G20 meeting underneath the US presidency with Donald Trump. Now, as you know, this is supposedly unusual because South Africa is a founding and permanent G20 member, although there is no real kind of charter to say who is and is not a founding member. Poland has been invited to take South Africa's place, and reportedly they will be going, just not as a G20 member. Now, according to South Africa, they chose not to attend the meeting without an invitation to avoid diplomatic humiliation. But the presidency insists that South Africa does not need permission to participate in the G20, and that the exclusion is procedurally illegitimate. And as I've said before, they just don't have to give you diplomatic visas. It's the easiest way to exclude you from the US. Like, they don't have to say you can't come, but they don't have to give you visas to go. That's the easy way. No visa, can't go. Simples. Now, Pretoria says that it will not boycott the US presidency, but instead insists that other nations, other G20 members, may want to push back against Washington's move so as to create pressure on Trump to somehow invite South Africa. Now, this whole thing became interesting because Ramaphosa said that he will not lobby for a boycott of the 2026 G20 meeting in the US. And he further says that he is not losing sleep over Trump or US hostility. Now, this was a deliberately cautious tone, bordering on submissive diplomacy. Now, why this is interesting is he said he will not lobby to boycott the G20, but then in other news, the presidency said that the other nations should. So he's not going to boycott it, but he suggests, the presidency's spokesperson suggests that the other G20 members should. So in any case, the net result of this is that South Africa is still technically inside the G20, but is increasingly being treated as expendable by the US. Now, in terms of the US, specifically the damage between the relationships between South Africa and the US, As you know, the US imposed steep tariffs on South Africa, 30% on key exports, automotive, agriculture, and the industrial exports. And as you know, this threatened jobs, export revenue, and investor confidence. Well, the trade minister has now temporarily issued new competition law exemptions. And according to these exemptions, this will now allow exporters to coordinate logistics, jointly market products, and pool resources for foreign market access. Now, these exemptions will last for 5 years. Now, the idea behind these is that the US has cut some key shipping routes to its market, with only one shipping company now sending goods to the United States. And what this has meant is that, well, there's less demand for South African goods. So the relaxation in competition laws is somehow to allow South Africa a form of crisis management to overcome the crisis that is the South African-US diplomacy debacle. But this isn't a growth strategy. The government is quietly admitting that South African exporters cannot compete under current conditions and that US trade retaliation is already hurting South Africa, which is why they've granted the exemptions. But this also shows how South Africa's foreign policy posturing, specifically in relation to China, Russia, Iran, and also its position against Israel, is now causing direct economic costs to the country. Now, turning on to economic costs, let's turn our attention to Starlink and what is going on in terms of Starlink. As you know, South Africa is meant to be opening the door to Starlink, but the reality is that no license has yet been granted, and there has yet been no rule change, only a policy signal shift, which has been sent to INCASA. Now, INCASA has still got to launch formal inquiries, calls for public comments, to hold hearings, and to issue findings. So a realistic timescale is, at best, late 2026. And with any form of legal challenges from ANC nut jobs, you're looking at 2027, 2028, or possibly later, before South Africa actually gets Starlink. So the government's posturing, saying we're going to get it, but not really. Now, why does this matter? Because South Africa desperately needs reliable broadband. It needs rural connectivity and investment certainty. And that's what Starlink brings. But ideological BEE rigidity continues to block progress. And you'll know all about that. That's the idea that Starlink has to give away 30% of its equity in order to get an operating license. Now, if you've been watching my videos, you will note that the communications minister signaled openness for employment equity investment alternatives instead of rigid ownership quotas. The DA supported the move, but the ANC, the EFF, and the MK party all oppose it. They say it's anti-transformational. Now, the deputy minister, the ANC deputy minister, has publicly rebuked his own minister for wanting to issue these directives to allow an alternative to cause economic growth. Because as far as the ANC is concerned, they cannot envisage a future where BEE grift is not a reality. Now, what this is exposing is a form of GNU functional instability, with ministers and deputies publicly opposed to each other, they're not actually getting on, and publicly contradicting each other, one saying I'm going to do this, and the other saying I'm not going to do that. And regulators like INCASA are now caught in between the law, ideology, and political pressure. They don't really know what to do. They can see the ANC say, oh, we don't like this, it's terrible, and the ministers giving them indications that they should change. And the result of this is policy paralysis, which is exactly, ladies and gentlemen, why the economy of South Africa is not growing. ANC policy uncertainty is killing South Africa. Now, whilst this is all occurring, the ANC is doing a tour of its branches in order to galvanize support for Ramaphosa ahead of the local government elections in 2026. What do you know? The latest tour is to the ANC youth leagues. Who knew that was still a thing? I thought that had collapsed with Juju, but apparently it's still a thing. Now, Ramaphosa went to give an address to the ANC Youth League, and he said, we rely on you to win the 2026 local government elections, and he frames 2026 as existential for the ANC, and he urges youth mobilization, door-to-door campaigning, and community rebuilding, because he recognizes that if the ANC loses in 2026, the ANC's days are done. Now, the reality on the ground is his speech was delayed by hours. Yet again, we see this with the family meetings. Ramaphosa doesn't pitch on time. Now, the conference descended into disorganization. there was credential chaos and singing and disruption during speeches, because this is the way the ANC now operates. Many of the leadership were absent or, frankly, just ineffective. So the Youth League itself, going to the Youth League was basically a giant waste of time. Now, part of the reason for this is because of the levels of unemployment with the youth in South Africa, with youth unemployment being catastrophic. Now, Ramaphosa did the usual thing where he goes and he gives the same speeches over and over again, where he focused heavily on gender-based violence messaging and suggested that universities teach men how to propose love to women. I really don't understand how that has anything to do with youth unemployment, but apparently Cyril thinks that this is what the youth want to hear. So the entire speech was considered to be tone deaf, given the economic collapse that many young South Africans feel. So what is the actual outcome of this? Well, as you know, in terms of the electoral context, well, the ANC's already dropped to 40% nationally in 2024, and they've lost control over key provinces and metros, and youth support is eroding rapidly, with the Youth League looking disorganized, undisciplined, and unprepared for governors or campaigning. So Ramaphosa went there and said, "We need you, please help us. 2026 is our D-Day, we might die." And for what? It's pretty much a waste of his time. So the big picture here, ladies and gentlemen, is that the US no longer treats Pretoria as a senior partner and considers us to be a joke. Economically, our foreign policy carries direct trade consequences, and yet the government refuses to be reactive in order to save jobs. The GNU is pretty unstable at this point in term, and South Africa is trying to project moral authority abroad, but basic governments at home really leaves a lot to be desired. So, what does this all mean? Well, there's growing dysfunction politically every day, and the likelihood of the ANC surviving 2026 becomes less and less and less. At least that's my opinions. Do let me know what you think in the comment section below, and until next time, bye.